The preschool lesson for Sunday, May 20th, 2012, is Lesson 5. Peter denies Jesus. This is found in Mark chapter 14, verses 26 to 72. That's a lot of stuff. That's a very, very long section, so it will ultimately be up to you how much you decide to teach in this one lesson. I think what they really want you to focus on is Peter denying Jesus, but there's a ton of material before that, so we'll go through it as best we can. 2 key points: Jesus would suffer completely alone. This section is really sad from Jesus' perspective. It's an awful, awful time, and everyone that he cares about the most, I guess, from a true man standpoint, his closest friends, they all leave him. The other part of this is we can become very confident in our own ability to resist sin and temptation. Peter did that. Jesus told him, "Tonight, Peter, you are going to desert me." And Peter said, "No, I won't. Everybody else will, but I won't." God was right. Jesus was right. Peter did desert him. So just an understanding that we need God's help to fight off temptation, to fight off sin. Some of the storytelling items. The story picks up right after Jesus has instituted the Lord's Supper, as he's set up communion. So they're walking out to the Mount of Olives, and as they're walking, Jesus tells the disciples, "All of you are going to desert me tonight." It was necessary. He had to suffer and die alone. There's nothing these guys really could have done to help him bear this burden. He's going to die for the sins of the entire world. And if they had helped him out, and if they had taken a stand, we might be deceived into thinking that they played a part in our salvation. They didn't. They weren't even around. Jesus, by doing this, by telling them you're going to desert me, is warning them ahead of time what will take place. Wants them to know this is exactly how it's going to go down. But when the time comes, all of them forget that. Later on, when Peter hears that crowing rooster, we'll talk about that jogs his memory, and he realizes this is exactly what Jesus said would happen, and here we are. Jesus had been spending time each night during Holy Week on this Mount of Olives. He'd go out there with his disciples. It was a nice place to just talk and pray. So that's how Judas knew he was going to be there. It wasn't that Judas just guessed or anything. They had gone there every night, so Judas thought they'll be there again. So the inner circle, we talked about that in a few lessons. Jesus' inner circle of Peter, James, and John. James and John were brothers. These 3 disciples got to see more things than the other 9 disciples saw. So they get to see Jesus really in the fullest depths as true man here, as he's contemplating dying for the sins of the entire world. And not just people that were alive at this time, but everyone, whoever has lived in the past, is living now and will live in the future. So that's just an unfathomable amount of sin Jesus is going to die for. And as you might imagine, he's really struggling with this. It's kind of putting him through the ringer emotionally and physically. He's praying here so hard. The Bible tells us his sweat becomes like drops of blood. You know how that is when you're anticipating something awful. You have something coming up in your life that you know is going to be pretty rough. Sometimes the anticipation is almost worse than actually going through it. And that's part of it here. Jesus knows that in a matter of hours, he's going to be crucified, die this horrible death. But not only that, he's going to die for all sin. He's going to feel the punishment of hell. The disciples were probably embarrassed when Jesus had to wake them up. If you read through this section, you'll notice that Jesus comes back periodically. He leaves them at a certain spot on the Mount of Olives. He walks further to pray. He comes back a couple times. The first time he comes back, he sees that they're all sleeping. He has to wake them up, and he kind of throws it out there to them. "Guys, you can't stay awake for just an hour to help me bear this burden." And they're probably a little bit embarrassed that they can't, but they're tired. It's late. It's been a pretty rough and emotional week. Jesus, we get part of his prayer here. He doesn't know of an alternative to dying for the sins of the world. He doesn't have another plan. He doesn't say, "God the Father, what if we do it this way?" He just says, "If it's your will, can we please do it another way?" But he doesn't have an alternative. The fact that Jesus asked if the cup could be removed, if his Father could think of any other way or figure out any other way, that doesn't mean that he ever stopped wanting to save us and wanting us to not die and go to hell, but go to heaven. That never ever stopped. It's just you see his human side here that's really struggling with the whole thought of having to go through this awful suffering and punishment. As Jesus prays more, his feelings change. You read the account, you notice he starts to get stronger. He starts to realize God's going to help me through this. Yeah, I can do it. And you notice that when he goes back a second time and sees the disciples sleeping again, he doesn't wake them up. He just kind of looks at them and says, okay, I guess they're just going to do that. When Judas arrived, he brings all the temple guards. They come to arrest Jesus. By that time, the disciples probably figured out, oh, Jesus is the one, or Judas is the one that's going to betray Jesus. They finally got what Jesus was saying in the upper room. Jesus greeted the group. He came up and said, who are you looking for? They said, Jesus of Nazareth. He said, I am he. So Judas didn't need to go through with his plan, but he did anyway. He goes up and kisses Jesus on the cheek. That's a pretty normal display of friendship back in these days. So it's just kind of extra crummy that he betrays him with this display of friendship. Only the Gospel of John reveals to us this fact, so it's not included in the Gospel of Mark. You don't have to mention this. But just for the sake of knowing what happened, Peter takes out his sword and tries to fight for Jesus' freedom, and all he ends up doing is cutting off the ear of one of the servants named Malchus. Now that shows us Peter's not he's not a soldier, he's a fisherman. So he's trying to kill Malchus, and he just knocks one of his ears off because he's not a good soldier. He doesn't know how to handle a sword. And you see how Jesus tells him right away, that's not what I'm looking for. He says, if I wanted to, Peter, don't you think I could get out of this? Don't you think I could call down, uses 72,000 angels? I could call down all these angels and I'd get out of it, but I don't. And then Jesus takes that ear of that servant and he heals it. The writer Mark, the gospel writer Mark, seems to indicate that he was here at this time. You can read there's just like one sentence in this section that says there was a young man who was with them, but in the struggle he lost his cloak and he ran away. And a lot of people feel like that's Mark saying, kind of confessing, I was there and I deserted Jesus too. Okay, the guards take Jesus to trial. He's kind of on this religious trial before the high priest and the other Jewish leaders. They gather in the middle of the night. You would expect that a religious court like this would put on a fair trial, but far from it. They weren't even supposed to be gathered at night. Night trials in the Jewish religion were illegal, so they're breaking their own laws just by meeting. As they're taking Jesus to this courtroom, Peter and John are following from a distance away. So Jesus gets taken into the courtyard, and Peter kind of follows along, kind of incognito, and he takes a spot by the fire outside. And you think this is Israel, why would they need a fire at night? Well, they're really high up. Jerusalem is really high in elevation. During the night, it would get pretty cold, so they would need to have a fire if you're outside. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the Jewish leaders are bringing in all sorts of false witnesses to testify against Jesus. But the funny part is, none of their testimonies match up. They're trying to condemn him with all these guys that are just making up lies, but none of their lies work together, so they can't get it done. So finally, the high priest steps in and he just asks Jesus point blank. He says, "Are you the Christ?" And if Jesus would have stayed silent, this would have been essentially the same as saying, "No, I'm not." So the high priest is thinking he's pretty smart here. He's going to put Jesus in a corner. Either he's silent and basically denies it, or he agrees, and this is blasphemy because this man here is saying he's God. And Jesus puts his life on the line and says, I am God. And he adds this warning. He says, "You'll see me coming on the last day." And the high priest takes his robes and he tears them. He's so angry. But that's all a show. This is exactly what he wanted. He wanted Jesus to say something like this so then they could kill him. At that point, it just gets worse and worse. The soldiers begin to beat Jesus as fun. I don't know. You get into a mob mentality. This seems like something pretty fun to do. Pretty terrible. So Jesus goes through a ton of awful stuff during this time. We go back outside. Peter's right in the middle of all of Jesus' enemies, kind of hanging out, trying to avoid anyone recognizing him. But there's a servant girl who notices Peter, and she says, "Aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" And Peter just kind of retreats, He says, no, 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 you got the wrong guy. It retreats. The rooster crows for the first time. Other people gather together, including a relative of this servant Malchus, the guy whose ear Peter cut off. One of his relatives comes and says, no, I think I saw you in the garden tonight. You're one of Jesus' disciples. And Peter says again, no, that's not me. And goes and tries to find a different part of the courtyard to stand in. And finally, another group for a third time comes and says, no, we are sure. You are a Galilean. You're one of Jesus' disciples. And this time, Peter flips out and he starts cursing and swearing and calling down an oath on himself and saying, I don't know the man, I tell you. And right at this point, the Bible tells us Jesus looks over and their eyes meet. Peter and Jesus, their eyes meet. And the rooster crows for a third time. And Peter realizes, oh no, I did just what Jesus said I was going to do. And the pain is tremendous, and he leaves. And he just goes out and weeps bitterly. Kind of a depressing end to this lesson, but we know where it goes. We know we're heading toward Easter. Just as far as the teaching items, Jesus went to great lengths to redeem us. You think about him in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's just struggling so much for us. Jesus didn't get everything he asked for when he prayed. He asked, Heavenly Father, please take this cup from me if there's any other way. And his Father tells him, no, this is the way we're going to do it. So we can expect, too, that sometimes the answer to our prayers is no. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that God doesn't love us. Jesus was innocent, but people didn't care about that at all. We proudly confess that we are Jesus' disciples. Unlike Peter, who shied away from it, it's so important for us to not, worry about that. We're Jesus' disciples. We know that he's going to protect us one way or the other. So even if we have to suffer for the sake of sharing our faith, that's okay. It'll be rough at the time, but the biggest thing is we're going home to heaven eventually, one way or the other. And finally, like we said, this is kind of a sad story, but the Bible records stories like this for a reason. It's so we can take warning from them, and we learn from them. And we do. We learn how important it is to rely on God to keep us out of temptation, and we know that God has promised he'll watch over us. All right, God bless your lesson.